So my name is Adie Fein. I'm going to deliver a talk titled Lives Before Letters, 3 Approaches to Queering Typography. It's especially nice to be here today of all days because it is currently International Transgender Day of Visibility. Convenient for me because I'm trans, so you could actually perceive me today. It also coincides with the thesis of my talk. Let's get it out of the way. My pronouns are they and them. So later today, to be a good ally, you should say things like, they gave the best lecture I've ever seen, or Nick Larson was really compelling, but they were so much more interesting and better dressed. Currently, I'm a graphic designer at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in Boston, though I live and fangirl for Providence, Rhode Island. I'll show some of that work as a brief intro to myself. I work within the school to do communications projects, lookbooks for potential students, event programs, dinner menus, social media, graphics, wayfinding signage, professional award swag, a little bit of everything. Largely, though, I create editorial illustrations to promote the studio, which is an in-person and televised programming that brings together panels of experts to discuss public health issues like tuberculosis or abortion or sleep. I also design a lot of presentations. This is one I made for a conference on food insecurity caused by climate change. Finally, I also do event branding. So this is for a conference on data governance for public and private health organizations. But this lecture won't be about my professional work, so you won't see any more of it. And this lecture really isn't even about me, but I want to show those again as an intro, but also for another more important reason, which is that in art and design programs, we often see the work of studios, but the professional world of design is significantly larger than that. Your only options when you leave here aren't to work at Pentagram or Apple. You can choose to work at a nonprofit, at an educational institution, for the government, or any number of organizations. There's a lot of unique positives and negatives to that. So if you want to, you can ask me questions about that at the end. But the actual focus of the talk is queerness and typography. What does it mean for type to be queer, or to use it as a verb, what does it mean to queer type? To begin to answer those questions, we'll look at a variety of ways that people have approached expressing queerness through typography, and I'm going to criticize most of it, because the thesis of this presentation, what I'll try to convince you of in the next 25 minutes, is that aesthetics are not politics. Style is not action. I want you to come away from this lecture believing that it's not enough for things to look nice, to feel good. Your work must do something. It must affect the world. And you can't do that with letters alone. So I divided the work into 3 categories. The first is aesthetics and representation. So that is the graphical quality of work, what it visually symbolizes, who makes it, who's reflected in it. 2 is performance and history. That is, where do these objects come from? What do they do? 3 is politics and community, where we ask, how can typography affect us? What does it mean for a font to be radical? Very quickly, before we start properly, what do I mean when I say queer? So you're all probably envisioning something like this, which speaks to sexuality, and sure, that's a part of it, but I'm trans femme. So for me, gender and queerness are intimately related. Who gets to be feminine or masculine is a queer political question. So there are a few things that I'll show during the presentation that might seem more feminist than queer, and you might be like, why is that feminist? And my answer to that is like, that women's and queer liberation are intimately connected, and to separate them intellectually or ideologically hurts everyone. So aesthetics and representation. The first thing I want to show you is Transgender Grotesque by Sasha Cheripanov. Hope I said that right. This is a typeface released on Type Today and Tomorrow in 2019. I reached out to Sasha and asked her where the name came from, and she said, I named it that simply because I was thinking about my own transition while I was making the typeface. I'm showing that as a very pure example of representation. There is nothing in it that explicitly relates to transness, but a trans person made it. Does that make it a queer font? Gilbert is a typeface made by Ogilvy, New York, and Font Self for NYC Pride in 2017. Hopefully you figured it out, but this font is super gay because it's rainbow colored. This is an example of symbolism. The rainbow flag is culturally connected to queerness, so we make the font rainbow colors, and the viewer can make the association between the two. The visual association between queer people and the font is what makes this type queer. This is Queer Type T-shirts by Mina Sakaria from 2015. She explored the relationship between gender and typography. In the West, at least, we culturally perceive fluid and light fonts as feminine and angular and dark fonts as masculine. What this work does is put feminine messages in mask type and masculine messages in fem type. So here we start to get a sense of how queering as a verb might work in typography. This project subverts gender stereotypes through the mismatch of content and aesthetic. Bless you. In this way, it challenges us as viewers. Nevertheless, I want to differentiate this from projects that I'll show later in the presentation by pointing out that this work still only functions at the visual symbolic level. It looks queer, but it doesn't necessarily act queer. This is Bumpy by Beatrice Cacchiotti, published in 2019. Hopefully you've noticed that this is one of the fonts I'm using in this presentation. Cacchiotti is also looking at the way we apply gender to letters. However, she's not simply flipping the association, which Beatrice says would reinforce a false gender binary. Rather, she's produced a variable font that moves between two logics of gender, one that's rigid and one that's fluid. On one end of our variable axis, she visually represents strict binary thinking. And on the other end, she visually represents a more expansive approach to gender. Furthermore, as a variable font, Bumpy resists conventional definition, aka typeface weights, and so might be called a non-binary font. So I think here you can see how we were doing something very similar to Zakaria, the previous project, but with greater abstraction and more nuance. And our last item in this section is Epicene, designed by Chris Soursby and released by his foundry Klim in 2022. This is a revival of a Fleischmann typeface. A lot of the features are quite ornamental, and Soursby was interested in the way that decoration has been viewed historically. That is, in the last 200 years, some have argued that decoration is feminine and feminine is bad, so decoration is bad. Soursby wanted to challenge that. Therefore, Epicene could be understood as queer insofar as it challenges gender tropes in type. However, what I'm more interested in is this claim that Soursby makes in the essay explaining the design process. He writes, Epicene is a firm statement that fonts have no gender. Soursby is not the first person to say or advocate for this position, which I've termed the gender-blind approach to typography. I want to spend a minute talking about this because it illustrates why the approach to queer typography as visual style or as aesthetic is unsuccessful, namely that it's completely disconnected from the lives of queer people. So first, let's look at the claim that fonts have no gender. Technically, Soursby is right. Fonts have no gender. There's no natural sex or gender category in type. However, fonts are gendered. We as humans apply gendered concepts to fonts, and that's not necessarily bad. When I go to a store, I buy products with typography that looks like this. I want to feel feminine, and this typography helps me do it. I want my gender to be affirmed by letters. When I'm at the store, I do not buy typography that looks like this because they give me gender dysphoria. They make me feel bad. It's the same reason that I wear a dress or wear makeup. Those are two things that also do not have a gender, but are gendered. And that's an important takeaway. Gender is not bad. It's okay and normal and historically common to have gender, to like your gender. You can be masc if you're a man and be femme if you're a woman. You can want typography to help you do that. The problem is not gender, and it's not even gender stereotypes. The problem is inequality. The issue isn't feminine fonts, but whether or not men are punished socially for using those fonts. In the same way, the issue is not whether dresses are considered feminine, but whether people who are not assigned female at birth can be punished legally for wearing dresses. People who advocate for the gender-blind approach to typography have lost sight of that. They've lost sight of how gender and queerness operate in daily life. So to return to typography as queer style or aesthetics, the issue is that these projects treat queerness as an abstraction. The fonts are abstract. They're only symbolic visual representations of queer people. But that means they're very far removed from real life, from queer people and their everyday experiences, the actual material joy and struggle of queer life. What does a rainbow typeface do? Does it make my life better? Maybe, but only insofar as I feel represented. It helps me as much as an I Love New York t-shirt helps New Yorkers. But it doesn't actually improve my life as a queer person. That is, it doesn't have any sort of political dimension. The trajectory of this talk over the next two sections is this. We'll look at work that is increasingly grounded in physical experience, in the reality of queer life. And as we do that, the work will increasingly take on political dimension. So in this next section, we'll look at work that doesn't treat queer people as an abstraction, as an intellectual concept that we can theorize about. Rather, we'll look at work that is grounded in experience, behavior, real lives. So even though this section relates more to real life, it is a little philosophical. So bear with me if it seems a little like spacey. I can't help it. I'm a theory slut. This section is titled Performance in History. So when I say performance, I'm referring to Judith Butler's idea of gender performativity. For Butler and for me, gender is constituted by a collection of acts. That is, you don't wear pink because you're a girl because you wear pink. The act produces gender. Performativity sort of reverses the order. So in this section, we're going to look at type that does not simply look fruity, that represents queerness as a visual quality alone. Instead, these fonts perform actions that express or constitute or perform queerness. The fonts act queer, and in that way, they are queer. Okay. Genderfail has published a series of protest fonts designed by B. Oakley. These fonts are based on lettering from queer protest signs. The one here comes from signs made by the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, the acronym for which is STAR, a very significant trans organization from the 70s. And this one comes from signs at a Black Trans Lives Matter protest. Now, hopefully you can see right away that how these are different from the projects we looked at in the previous section. Whereas those express queerness stylistically, the Genderfail protest fonts are engaged in the memorialization of queer history. Normally they work as functional design objects, which we could say express a queer aesthetic through representation or their sort of outside or non-professional visual qualities. But they're also preserving something, they're historicizing. So in that sense, they're performing queer acts. Additionally, we see Genderfail use licensing to create solidarity. Queer, trans, NB, BIPOC people get free commercial use of the fonts. Here we see the apparatus around the typeface, the license, it's queer. It's not just the graphical element, the visual letters. This is another project called Queer Year of Love Letters by Nat Piper that does something very similar. So Piper deeply researches obscure or less well-known queer organizations and people, locates some hand-drawn type they used on a flyer or a zine, and transforms it into a font. So here an advertisement for the Women's Car Repair Collective is transformed into a typeface. And this typeface transforms a protest sign used by Ernestine Eckstein into a font. Piper describes this work as creating lineages. Queer people by necessity must establish families outside of biological genetic ancestry. Queer history is identification with and between disconnected, diverse people over time. What I mean is, I have no relationship to, say, Oscar Wilde or Audre Lorde, and yet I imagine them as my queer forebearers. So these fonts do more than look interesting or look gay. They're building community across decades and across centuries. Piper also encodes biographical information in these figures, about these figures in the metadata of the fonts. So like Genderfail, the whole system is queer, not just the visual component. Okay, so I'm going to show you another project from Piper, but first we're going to look at two things that'll help you understand it. The first is Gay Semiotics by Hal Fisher from 1977. This photo series explores how homosexuality was encoded into fashion at the time. And the second is two photos from Catherine Opie. She captures visibly queer people in traditional portraiture positions. A particular note here is pervert cut across her chest in the photo on the left. And then you can faintly see pervert as healed scars on the photo on the right chest. So I bring up Fisher and Opie only to highlight that queer identity always exists in relationship to a body, the clothes it wears, the shape it has. In Opie, queerness is literally impressed onto the body. So Nat Piper's made a collection of wearable typographic posters or books. You recall that gender as performance means that gender is constituted, established, made up of acts. Acts like wearing certain clothes or making certain movements. So in this work, we see queerness as written values or written concepts, visualized and enacted by typography. In the same way that clothes constitute or construct gender for Judith Butler, in this work, we see letters constitute gender or sexuality or queerness. This is very purely typography as performance. This is Pussy Galore, a font from 1994 by the Women's Design and Research Unit. It is 4 sets of wingdings within it. One represents choice as in bodily autonomy. Another represents bad language as in slag or whore. And the two on the screen represent empowerment and gender stereotypes. Here, the glyphs can be inserted into a block of text to highlight gendered concepts that enter writing. So in that way, they kind of annotate the text that they're a part of. Of course, that needed to be done manually in the 90s, but with modern font technology, we can do it automatically. So this is a project by Adie, Fein, that's me. It is a font called Times Neutral Roman. When using the font, whenever a gendered term is written out, it's replaced by an unspecified marker, that X rectangle. So that's referencing the X markers used on legal documentation like driver's license in place of the M or the F. So for me, the unspecified marker is a way of creating space within language. They're a kind of refusal of gendered language and a refusal of systems that enforce gendered categories. In that sense, they're queering language, queering documentation. The font also presents interesting formal opportunities. So if gender is central to a text that you're setting, then perhaps gendered language needs to appear in a different typeface like we see here. That requires extra labor. That also highlights the gendered language. This also separates this project from the gender-blind approach to typography, because the fact of the matter is we need gendered language and gendered tools to talk about gender-based oppression. This is the last item. Okay. So this is the last item in our performance and history section, just reflecting on what we just saw. I hope you agree that these are more connected to the lives of queer people, either through history, through direct connection to experience, or by trying to modify behavior in a queer way. But even though these are closer to people and so seemingly more likely to improve their lives, I still want to be pretty critical of all of this. Take my project, for example, Times Neutral Roman. What is the likelihood that that'll actually benefit a queer person? Sure, if someone uses it, they need to think more seriously about gender, but who's using that font? Probably already someone who cares, so it's not likely changing anyone's mind at all. There's no political force to it. In this final section called Politics and Community, I want to continue exploring that idea. How can typography do something to benefit people? How can typography advocate for political or behavioral change to meaningfully improve the everyday lives of queer people? And I want to start by reading a passage from Paul Suellis's essay, What is Queer Typography? This is the conclusion of his piece. He writes, "We need to stay with queer as an action, actively engaging with the past and the future as a verb, as in queer acts of disrupting, interrupting, agitating. I propose that we turn away from rainbow style and gender metaphors in typography towards queer acts of doing. We ought to perform deviant acts of design in the face of conformity." Now, I love this essay. It's generous, it's thought-provoking. Paul's an excellent writer, and I think of him as a mentor. The first thing I want to point out is the similarity between what Paul says and what I've been arguing up until this point. That is, when we think of queer typography, we can simply think about style, but it's far more important that we focus on what letters do. This is what makes typography queer in a meaningful way, that it performs queer acts. And I think the stuff I showed in the previous section does that. Where Paul and I diverge, though, is that I don't think he goes far enough. That is, though Paul rejects rainbow style, as he calls it, he still limits us to the sphere of design. So I want to make a bold claim right now, and that is that there are no deviant acts within design in and of itself. And in fact, to focus on typography or graphic design is to lose sight of what we should care about. To jump back to my critique of gender-blind typography, the issue is not gender stereotypes. The issue is inequality. I want to parallel that and say the issues at stake here are not typography or they're not graphic design. The issue is the material lives of queer people. The question we should be asking is not what is queer typography. The question is, how can we make queer lives better? Can typography do that? So now let's look at three things that might actually have made people's lives better. The first is queer zines. Zines, which are low-cost DIY publications, have always been deeply important to marginalized people. When you read historical accounts from trans people, consistently they'll say how they didn't know transitioning was an option until much later in their life because they never read or met or heard from another trans person. Before the internet, before Grindr, it was often challenging to find other people like you. Queer zines offered a space for identification and exploration. They actively built community. They made families. You'll notice on some of these that the type is pretty boring. A lot of it definitely doesn't feel aesthetically queer. Nevertheless, I would say this is real queer typography because it built unity amongst people. It manifested community, and in that sense, it made queer lives better. The second is the AIDS Memorial Quilt by the Names Project, which started in 1987. The quilt is made up of panels. Each panel has the name of one or more person that died of AIDS-related causes. Currently, the quilt is made up of 48,000 panels, honoring more than 90,000 people. It's arguably the largest community art project in the world, but no one really ever talks about it as a typography project, even though it's made up almost exclusively of letters. The quilt clearly expresses a few qualities that I've been promoting. It memorializes queer history, it creates community, bringing people together. But the quilt also had other goals. It raised awareness about the massive number of people that were hurt by AIDS, and it raised millions of dollars for community-based AIDS prevention and education organizations. So this remarkable piece of typography that has done so much for queer people, it is a remarkable piece of typography that's done so much for queer people. And yet when we look at this, it doesn't necessarily have a queer aesthetic. The last thing I'll show you is the work of Grand Fury. They were a collective of artists who merged from the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which is known as ACT UP, and that was a super important political group. Grand Fury worked from 1988 to 1995, and they produced some of the most important and lasting visuals of the AIDS pandemic, like the Silence Equals Death poster. But I want to talk about Grand Fury not because they made compelling graphics or because there's anything aesthetically queer about the fonts chosen here. I'm bringing up Grand Fury because they were designers who used typography to political ends. And that didn't look just like making visually appealing stuff. They had communication plans, they had distribution plans, they raised money, they worked with other organizations, and that holistic approach had positive results, changing laws, saving lives. And so when I ask what is queer typography, how can we answer anything but this? Typography as political action. Nothing else can address inequality, nothing else can improve lives. When I reflect on the work in this presentation, my own, Nat Piper's, B. Oakley's, all people that I deeply admire, I find that work visually compelling, but it fails to be radical because it has no strategy. All graphic design fails without a network, without plans for distribution, without reproduction. Ultimately, design is about communication, not just of aesthetic symbols, but of content. Without that, typography cannot build power, cannot build community, cannot be political, cannot be radical. So my first challenge to you is this: stop thinking about typography as a thing that you make, as art that you put in your portfolio, and start thinking about it as a tool for action. Imagine typography as a site for change, the axis on which political action and community organization happens. So find causes to support, find nonprofits or protest groups or community organizations to work with. That is where queer typography happens. That is queer typography. And so that's my first challenge to you. And now we're going to have a moment of praxis. I've been advocating for two things: politics over style and typography as a tool for action. So here's the moment where I show you what that might look like by turning this presentation into a vehicle for political advocacy. As I mentioned, today is Transgender Day of Visibility. Currently, there's a wave of anti-trans legislation sweeping across the country. This is Aaron Reed's anti-trans legislation risk map. It shows where the worst anti-trans laws are being proposed and adopted. It also shows what states are safe for trans people. So by looking at this map, you can understand that I would not feel safe delivering this talk in Oklahoma or Arkansas or Tennessee. There are laws proposed or currently active, which under some legal interpretations mean I could be arrested or fined for dressing as I am right now. And I look really fucking good, so you know immediately that's a dumb law. So I hope you can understand why I'm a little fed up with graphic designers drawing gay little letters, as my community's rights are being actively diminished across the country. This doesn't mean, though, that typography has no role to play in queer liberation. In fact, this whole presentation is me searching for typography's role. So here's how you can use letters to political ends. Email your local politicians. Make a sign and attend a protest. Design flyers for a local organization, or design flyers to help people find the protest, or to explain anti-trans legislation. Or simply just text your queer friends. Ask them how all of them is making them feel and how you can support them. Because honestly, this is a more powerful typographic intervention than another silly typeface. Your rainbow fonts aren't going to save us.